To get started, I'm going to cut the parts that I need to rough length. I'm going to do that with a miter saw, and then I'm going to bring them over to my table saw and cut them to the rough width. Now, I've pulled out my jointer to flatten one face and actually square one edge as well. And that's the edge that I just cut on a table saw, and I'm going to do this with all of the pieces that I have. I also need to make this stock thinner, so I've marked a line on here, and I'm going to make those cuts on my bandsaw. Now, the bandsaw makes a pretty good cut, but it's still not as smooth as I want. Also, it's not completely parallel to the other side, so I'm going to use my thickness planer on all of the parts to bring them down to the final thickness. All of these parts are either 4 inches wide, and that's the first lot that I'm cutting. I'll move the fence over 1 inch and cut the 5-inch pieces as well. Now that I have the stock prepped, I can lay out the parts. The first ones are going to be the legs, and I'll be doing those in sets. The front 2 legs are the same, and then the back 2 legs are the same also. So the first step is to mark the correct length, and then I can bring it over to the miter saw and set that to 15 degrees. And then once that's cut, I can flip the stock around and cut the other end at the same angle. And before I do anything else with that first set, I'll do the second pair of legs as well. All right, so now I need to lay out the holes that I need to drill in these legs so that they'll be able to pivot. And these holes are 1.5 inches, and they're 2 5/8 down from the very point of the angle that I cut, and right in the middle of the stock. I got the same thing happening on the angled cut of the other pair of legs, but up at the top where it's going to be rounded over, the hole is 2 inches from the end and also centered in the stock. Now, rather than laying out all 4, I'm just going to do them in pairs, drilling a small hole through, and that small hole will mark the second leg, and then I can use the bigger Forstner bit to drill the holes through. Okay, I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit here. What I really should have done was drawn the rounded ends on these shorter legs before I drilled the hole. But luckily there's an easy fix for that. I've taken a piece of cardboard and I've drawn a 4-inch circle on there, cut it out with a pair of scissors, and I'll use that as the template. All 4 of the lower legs are the same size, so I can cut them all at the same time. I'm going to change the angle on my saw so that I get a 110-degree angle for the cut at the top. And I also want to taper these slightly at the bottom, mainly for looks. And I'll change the angle again and cut them one at a time. Next, I'm going to make the pivots that will fit in those holes that I drilled in the legs. And I've got a scrap of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood here. And the fastest way to do this is to use the drill bit that I drilled the holes with. And that'll mark where I need to cut. And I can cut them on the bandsaw and fine tune the fit on the belt sander. That 1/2 inch blade I got on my bandsaw is good for making the straight cuts, but I want to get a smaller one put on to make these circular cuts and save myself a little bit of time. Luckily, changing the blade on my bandsaw is very quick and easy. I release the quick release tensioner, take the old blade off, put the new blade on, tension it up again, and adjust the guide blocks. And all of that takes less than 5 minutes to do. And now because I milled the stock for the legs thicker than I originally planned, I made another set of discs that builds out the thickness of the 3/4 inch plywood. Not strictly necessary, but something that I wanted to do. Now that I have all that done, I need to make more components for the legs. I have a lot of scrap 1/2 inch plywood that I can use for that, just to get rid of it. I need 6 of these, and they're all the same length, and they also get that extra tapering cut on the end. And then, like the top of the back legs, these ones get rounded over on the top as well. I also kind of forgot that I need to round over these corners as well. So once again, I'm going to use my cardboard template to mark those out, and then I'll cut them on the bandsaw and fine tune the curve on the belt sander. When you're doing a build like this, none of the tolerances are very tight. The curves that I'm cutting don't have to be precise. These are just for clearance so that the legs will bend. With those parts made, I can begin assembly by gluing and pin nailing the plywood to the lower section of the leg. This side of the lower section of the leg can be glued together, so I'm doing it. The other side needs to be screwed together so I can take it apart. And when I'm putting these together, I'm doing them in pairs. Next, I can fasten the pivots, and I'm going to be using glue again, but a single screw this time, driven through the plywood and into the pivot. And before the glue sets, it's a good idea to check it to make sure that the upper leg lines up properly and swings freely. While I'm at it, I can get the piece that I made to thicken these fastened as well, and I'll be using glue and then pin nails to hold it in place while the glue sets. Now before I can start putting these legs together, I need to do one other operation here, and that's cut a 1/2 inch wide slot in the upper part of the leg, and this is for the mechanism that locks the lower leg in place. And this is part of the build that I put a lot of thought into. I want something that's going to be easy to use and also easy to make and be durable enough so it's not going to break. Now when I put the upper leg on the lower one, I can see that I've got a little bit too much of a gap here. I can leave it, it's not that big of a deal, but I can also fix it very easily by adding a shim. Next, I can get the piece of plywood on the outside, temporarily at least, by putting in a couple of screws. And then I can get the locking mechanism put on. And like I said, it's very simple. It's just a block of 3/4 inch plywood. It has a slot cut in the middle that's the same width as the slot that I cut in the leg. And this allows a locking cleat to slide back and forth. And to spring load it so it stays in place, I'm using a piece of sponge rubber. This is actually a piece of old sanding sponge that I cut up. Now I need to mark and cut notches in that plywood piece, and that'll be for the cleat to lock into. The back legs go together the same way, except these only have that plywood on one side. The other side just gets a circular piece of plywood that holds the joint together. Now that I have the legs done, I can start working on the rest of the parts. And the first one is a pair of parts for the top that are the same. And these need to be made from either 3/4 inch plywood or 2 layers of 1/2 inch. And I just happen to have a piece of 3/4 inch Baltic birch. That's exactly the right size for me to cut both of these parts out of. Next, I need to fasten the pivots on the inside. And these are for the front legs, the ones that have the treads. And I'm just going to use the leg itself to line up where to fasten it. I really should have countersunk that before I drove the screw in. I'm going to take it out again, countersink it, drive the screw back in, and then add the thickening disc on top. Once again, using glue and pin nails to hold it in place. Now I can flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. These pivots are for the back legs. I've temporarily taken the front legs apart again, and that's so that I can cut the dados for the treads to fit into. I've carefully marked these out, and I set up a couple of guides for the router to cut these out. With that done, I can get the treads fastened in place. I don't want to use any glue here, so I'm just using screws, but they are extra long. Screws don't hold very well in end grain, so the extra length really helps. Now I can get the hinges put together. Once again, I'm not going to be using any glue on these, just 1.5 inch screws to hold the joint together. Now this cleat that I'm adding on the back here stops the back legs from opening too far. The stretcher that I'm adding here is a scrap of 1/2 inch plywood. These will keep the back legs together and keep them from spreading out. So this is the progress so far. I need to talk about a couple of mistakes that I made. First one is that, if you can recall, I said that this part here, this piece of plywood, could either be 3/4 inch plywood or 2 layers of 1/2 inch. And when I originally drew it, it was 2 layers of 1/2 inch. And then when I got to this stage, I realized why it was 2 layers of 1/2 inch. If it's not, these legs won't fold under and clear each other, okay? Because you got plywood on the inside and plywood on the outside of this one. That's 2 layers that have to be up here. So what I did was I made donuts to go on the inside here to build it out, 1/4 inch thick, and that fixed that problem. However, this is another problem I discovered. This can't be, this joint here, this can't be articulating. It has to be fixed. Otherwise, the thing will fold up. It just won't stay upright. Like if you look at a step ladder A step ladder will have the front steps and the top part fixed. They don't move, they don't fly. It's the back part that goes down, that opens up. That's hinged up at the top. The other part, this part here, is fixed. So I'm going to have to glue these joints together on both sides and fix it in place. Not a big deal, right? It's just to take it apart as it is right now, put some glue in there, and then put it back together and make sure it's in the right position. Next step is to build the struts that go from the front legs to the back legs. These need to fold up, so they're going to be in two pieces, hinged in the middle. And I worked this out beforehand by making a simple mock-up using scraps of wood and screws to determine what the best length was. And now I can make them from more scrap half-inch plywood. Like I said, these links need to be hinged, and in the middle I'm going to do it in the same way that I did with the legs. There'll be a bigger hole and then a plug that fits in there, and then a cap that holds the two parts together. And where it fastens to the legs, I'm just going to use 1.5 inch screws because I've got enough wood behind it to drive the screw into. Next, I can start working on the vise that will be on the top. And it's a twin vise, so I need 4 guide rails, and that's what I'm cutting here. I'm making these from the offcuts left over from cutting the other parts for the project. Now the guide rails will be linked on the front by a solid piece of wood that goes across the front, and I need to drill a couple of holes in there for the lead screws. With that done, I can start putting it together, fastening the guide rails to that front piece. I'm using a spacer in between the rails to keep them the right distance apart. And I'm not using any glue here, just screws, just in case I need to take this apart at some point in the future. I'm going to make the parts that slide back and forth in those guide rails from more scrap 3/4 inch plywood. And I need to drill a hole right down through the center of these for the lead screw to fit through. So I'm going to make use of the functionality of my drill press modification that has a vise built in to clamp that in place so I can drill that straight down through it. The lead screws are 3/8 inch threaded rod, and I gotta get some nuts on here. 2 at the back will lock together to hold the lead screw in place, and then I can thread on 1 from the front, and this one will be tightened against the back of the crank. I need to put a T-nut in the ends of those 3/4 inch plywood blocks that I cut, and I'm also putting in a small screw to lock that in place. Now that I have that done, I can add a piece on top of it. There's another scrap of 1/2 inch plywood. I'm going to push the bottom block over to one side fully, and then I can get these fastened in place with pin nails, and that'll hold it until I can get some screws put in there. This is the other side of the top, the moving part, and the 1 inch holes that I'm drilling here are the same dog holes that I drilled in the other side, but I also need to drill 1.5 inch holes for the vise. Now these pivots that I just made fit inside those 1.5 inch holes. Also, I need a piece on top that's slightly bigger that will hold that side of the top down. But first I need to route out the space for it in the top, and I'm going to use a rabbiting bit to do that. The only thing left to make is a pair of cranks to operate the vise. Once again, I'm using scrap plywood. I'm just going to draw it out, cut it out on the bandsaw, fine tune it on the belt sander, and then put it together with the T-nut inside that threads onto the lead screw. While I was waiting for the glue to dry on that, I made a 1 inch dowel from maple, and I need this to make the handles for the cranks and also the bench dogs that fit in the top. Just to make sure that these cranks don't loosen up, I'm going to put in a pin to lock them in place. And then, like I said, the bench dogs are just 1 inch dowel, but I'm going to cut a notch in it so that it has a flat spot to grip the work. And speaking of gripping the work, the beauty of this vise is that it will skew so that you can hold odd-shaped pieces in it. This is a feature that I thought of when I was building it, to clamp a piece in the middle so you have a solid top to work on. Even though I made a couple of mistakes on this project, it's still a keeper. I can really see this coming in handy around the house.